So we've seen a number of methods for dealing with overallocation of resources. Another method for dealing with the overallocation of resources, or one potential method, is to pay overtime. So if we've assigned somebody to a task and it's more than they can physically do, then we can give them overtime, in which case they will do the work outside of the paid normal hours and therefore pick up the overtime rates. So if we look at our remove old units, where our poor project manager is trying to do two things at once, if we firstly look at the resource sheet, we can see that in this particular working file, we've given our project manager an overtime rate. Now, we didn't originally when we allocated our resources, but we just wanted to add in an overtime rate for this particular working file so that you can see the difference in the costs. So he gets 30,000 a year. Normally, if he has to do any overtime, he gets prorated 40,000 per year. So back in the Gantt chart, it's this remove all units that's causing us problems. So let's have a look at the split. And in the bottom half, we can see the project manager has to do 40 hours. Just right click and choose cost and make a note of how much that's costing us to have the project manager do that. And it's 576.92. Go back to resources and predecessors. There are 40 hours of work to be done here, but he also has to do work on the other task. So if we were to say, okay, Bob, or whatever the project manager's called, let's pay you 10 hours overtime. So that out of this 40 hours for this particular task, removing the old units, you can do 30 hours during normal working hours and then do the other 10 as paid overtime, so outside the normal working hours. In order to assign that overtime, we need to change this bottom section. So we choose right click and work. And here you can see for the first time a column called OVT work, so overtime work. And we can make a change. So our project manager, he has to do 40 hours work. That's how much work's involved in removing these old units. But what we'd like him to do, 30 hours of normal work, and then in the overtime work column, 10 hours of work. And then OK. Now what will appear to happen is effectively nothing. The duration doesn't change, the assignments don't change, the redness has gone because he's now not over allocated because he's doing 30 hours during the normal week, which leaves him time to do this other task without being over allocated. But this 10 hours overtime does not then display on the Gantt chart. If I look at the costs, now what appears to have happened is there's actually been a cost decrease to 480.77, whereas previously it was 576.92. Now the reason for that, and it's certainly worth demonstrating here, is that the overtime hours, for whatever reason in Microsoft's mind, do not pick up the overtime costs if the costs are denoted in years. So what we need to do is go back to the resource sheet, close that resource sheet, and here where we're saying paying 40,000 per year pro rata for his overtime rate, we really need to put in an hourly rate. So let's say he gets $100 per hour for any overtime work. Back to the Gantt chart, remove old units, put the split back in, and you can see it actually remembered which table I was looking at. The cost has now spiraled to 1,288.46. So that's his 480.77. So although the red man has disappeared, the red icon has disappeared, when we look at the actual calculation, this doesn't seem to quite add up. If he's doing 10 hours overtime, that's 1,000, that's the easy bit. And then if we look at the work, doing 30 hours of work, but the cost of that other proportion, so the bit above the 1,000, has dropped to 288.46, which if you recall, it was 576 for 40 hours. 288 is actually half of that. When you add in overtime work here as a number, it is actually part of the total work. By doing it this way, we're saying, okay, he's going to do 30 hours work, not the original 40, 20 hours at normal rate, and 10 hours at overtime. So in this case, we've actually saved the amount of work involved, therefore reducing the overallocation. Really, that should stay at 40 hours with an overtime of 10. Okay, it brings back the overallocation, but in the cost is now worked out to be 30 hours at the normal rate and then 10 hours of overtime, which gives me the 1432. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't solve the overallocation. The reason for that is in this particular case, the overallocation is caused by this double clashing. Project manager trying to do two jobs at once. In the case of our unpack new units, where we've got 5 joiners, which we don't have, we only have 4, trying to do a day's work, In this case, if we go into work and say, okay, there's 40 hours work, of which 10 hours can be overtime, and say, okay, that does solve the over allocation because my 4 joiners can do 5 joiners' work by doing this 10 hours of overtime. Now that's between them. So 5 into 10 is 2 hours each. So effectively their day will be 2 hours longer in order to get the unpacking of new units done without employing another joiner. So in this particular scenario, the overtime has worked well for us. It's resolved the over allocation, not involved us having to employ another joiner. We simply employ the current 4 joiners for an extra 2 hours each, which gives us our 10 hours overtime. That will, of course, have had a knock-on effect to the cost because there will be 30 hours at their normal rate and then this 10 hours paid at the overtime rate. So that's overtime as a potential way of solving over allocation. Obviously, it's not appropriate in all cases, as we've seen here, where our project manager is effectively over allocated, stretched beyond his means. But possibly the last method of resolving over allocations will be the one that solves that one for us.